Garrett Vaughn stood outside one of his auto repair shops, adjusting the brim of his worn-out baseball cap. His heart pounded with anticipation. He had built this company from the ground up, turning a single garage into a chain of 8 locations. But something wasn't right lately. He had been hearing complaints about rude service, dishonest pricing, and employees cutting corners. He needed to see it for himself. Disguised as a new trainee mechanic, Garrett wore grease-stained overalls, scuffed boots, and a pair of thick glasses. He had never personally met most of the employees at this location, especially since his district manager handled hiring and training. To them, he was just Gary, the new guy. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the shop's door. The scent of motor oil and burnt rubber filled the air. The garage was busy, cars up on lifts, wrenches clanking, and mechanics barking orders at each other. Garrett stood near the entrance, waiting for someone to acknowledge him. Instead, he heard voices behind him. 2 technicians, both leaning against a tool chest, were talking in hushed tones. "Man, I can't believe we got away with that yesterday," one of them said, shaking his head. "Charged that lady for a full brake replacement when all she needed was new pads." Garrett's stomach twisted. "Yeah, but who cares?" the other mechanic scoffed. "She didn't know any better. We hit our sales quota, and that's all that matters. Besides, Chris doesn't give a damn as long as the money keeps rolling in." Chris, the shop manager. Garrett clenched his jaw. He had trusted Chris to run this place with integrity. Before he could say anything, a man in his late 40s, with a beer belly and a permanent scowl, stomped over. "You the new guy?" Garrett nodded. "Yeah, Gary. Just starting today." Chris grunted, barely looking at him. "Great, another one. Listen, rookie, I don't have time for babysitting. Just do what you're told and stay out of the way." Garrett bit his tongue. He wasn't here to argue, he was here to observe. Chris turned to the 2 mechanics. "You two, stop standing around. We got a customer waiting. And remember, upsell, upsell, upsell." The men chuckled and walked off, leaving Garrett standing there, his pulse racing. This was worse than he thought. Garrett followed Chris through the cluttered garage, stepping carefully over discarded rags and stray bolts. The shop felt chaotic, not the well-oiled machine he had envisioned when he expanded his business. A car sat on a lift with its hood propped open, while a mechanic leaned against the workbench, scrolling through his phone instead of working. Chris gestured toward a toolbox. "Grab a wrench." "You're shadowing Evan today." A man in his early 30s with grease-streaked arms walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. His uniform was faded and his knuckles were scarred from years of hard labor. He looked Garrett over, then let out a tired sigh. "Another newbie, huh?" Evan muttered. "They never last." Garrett kept his expression neutral. "Guess we'll see." Evan gestured toward the car on the lift. "Come on, we're doing a transmission flush. It's a pain, but it pays well if you do it right." As they worked, Garrett noticed Evan's movements efficient, precise. He clearly knew what he was doing. But there was something else, too. A weariness in his posture, the kind that came from years of being overworked and undervalued. Garrett handed him a tool, then decided to push for more information. "So, what's the deal with this place? Seems hectic." Evan let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "That's one way to put it. Chris runs things how he wants. You either play along or you don't last." Garrett tightened a bolt, keeping his tone casual. "Play along with what?" Evan hesitated before answering. "Look, I don't like half the stuff that goes on here, but I got bills to pay. Chris pushes us to upsell on every job, even when it's not needed. A lot of guys don't care, but I do. I tried speaking up once. That was a mistake." Garrett glanced at him. "What happened?" Evan's jaw tightened. "Got my hours cut for a month. Lost overtime, barely made rent. Learned my lesson." Garrett felt the weight of Evan's words settle in his chest. He had built this company to be honest, reliable. Yet here was a man who actually cared about doing the right thing, and he was being punished for it. Before Garrett could respond, Chris's voice cut through the garage. "Hey, Evan. Stop chatting and get back to work. We don't pay you to stand around." Evan's shoulders tensed, but he didn't argue. He just turned back to the car, his expression unreadable. Garrett clenched his fists. He had seen enough. But he wasn't done yet. By lunchtime he had witnessed more than he could stomach. A young woman had come in for an oil change only to be pressured into replacing her air filter and battery, neither of which she needed. Another customer, an older man on a fixed income, was told his brake pads were dangerously worn when they still had plenty of life left. And every time, Chris was either directing it or turning a blind eye. Garrett sat outside on the curb eating a sandwich he had brought with him. Evan joined him, stretching out his legs with a tired groan. "You thinking about sticking around, Gary?" Evan asked, taking a bite of his own food. Garrett looked at him, then back at the shop. "I don't know yet." Evan exhaled sharply. "Smart. This place will drain you if you let it." Garrett wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the act. Every part of him wanted to march back in and fire Chris on the spot. But he needed to be sure. He needed to see just how deep the problem ran. Because if this was happening here, how could he be certain it wasn't happening at his other locations too? Garrett wiped his hands on a rag, his mind churning as he watched Chris hover near the customer waiting area. A man in his 60s stood at the counter, shifting uncomfortably while one of the service advisors tapped away at a computer. The man's car, a modest sedan with some wear and tear, had been up on the lift earlier. Garrett had seen one of the mechanics checking it over, shaking his head as he muttered something to Chris. Chris leaned in toward the customer, his voice just loud enough to carry across the garage. He spoke with an air of forced sympathy. "The issue is worse than we thought. Your radiator's on its last legs. You're looking at a full replacement, and that's not cheap." The older man hesitated, gripping the strap of his worn leather wallet. "Are you sure? I just had it checked a few months ago, and they said it was fine." Chris let out a slow breath, tilting his head slightly. "It might have been fine then, but parts wear down fast. You don't want to be stranded somewhere, do you?" Garrett's jaw tightened. He had seen the diagnostics himself. The radiator wasn't in perfect shape, but it wasn't anywhere close to failing. Chris was pushing an unnecessary repair, and the customer clearly didn't have money to spare. The man rubbed his temple. "I don't know if I can afford that right now." "How much are we talking?" Chris named a figure that made Garrett's stomach turn. The price was nearly double what the job should have cost. The customer exhaled sharply. "That's way more than I expected." Chris shrugged, his tone casual. "We could do a payment plan, but I'd really recommend taking care of this today." Garrett had heard enough. He stepped forward, keeping his voice steady. "I'll take a look at it." Chris turned, his expression darkening. "What?" Garrett wiped his hands on his overalls, nodding toward the car. "I was working with Evan earlier. We checked the radiator. Didn't see anything worth replacing." Chris's eyes narrowed slightly, but he forced a smile. "You're new. Let the professionals handle this." The customer looked between them, uncertainty flickering across his face. Garrett knew he had to tread carefully. If he pushed too hard, Chris would shut him down. Garrett kept his tone even. "I get that I'm new, but I've been working on cars a long time. If it's shot, I'll back you up. Let me double check." Chris hesitated, then exhaled through his nose. "Fine. But don't waste time." Garrett nodded and grabbed a flashlight, moving toward the car. Evan appeared beside him, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing?" Garrett kept his focus on the radiator. "Making sure this guy doesn't get cheated." Evan hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "Chris isn't gonna like that." Garrett didn't care. He ran his fingers along the hoses, checked the seals, and inspected the core. There were signs of wear, but nothing that warranted a full replacement. A simple flush and some minor maintenance would keep it running fine for a long while. He straightened up and turned back to the customer. "It's not perfect, but it's not failing. If you want, we can do a cooling system service, and that'll keep it running strong." He named a price that was far more reasonable. The man's face flooded with relief. "That's much better." Chris's expression darkened further. "Gary, can I talk to you in my office?" Garrett wiped his hands on his rag again, nodding. He followed Chris into the cramped office at the back of the garage. The door shut behind them with a dull thud. Chris leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "I don't know who you think you are, but you don't question me in front of customers." Garrett met his gaze evenly. "I wasn't questioning you. I was making sure we weren't overcharging someone who didn't need the work." Chris let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "That's how this business works, kid. You think dealerships don't pad their invoices? You think other shops don't do the same?" Garrett crossed his arms. "That's not how I was taught to do things." Chris's expression hardened. You want to last here? Keep your head down and do your job. Otherwise, you won't be around long. Garrett held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. Got it. Chris exhaled sharply. Good. Now get back to work. Garrett turned and walked out, his pulse steady. He wasn't afraid of Chris. The man had no idea who he was dealing with. Evan approached him as he stepped back into the garage. That looked intense. Garrett nodded slightly. Yeah. Evan hesitated. You should be careful. Chris doesn't like people stepping out of line. Garrett glanced at him. Neither do I. Evan frowned slightly, but before he could say anything else, another car pulled into the bay. Garrett wasn't done yet, but now he knew exactly what needed to happen. Garrett stepped out of the office, his mind already made up. Chris had shown his true colors, and there was no salvaging this. He wasn't just turning a blind eye, he was actively encouraging dishonest practices, punishing employees who wouldn't play along, and treating customers as little more than walking wallets. Garrett had seen enough. It was time to end this. He walked straight through the garage, past the workstations, past the stacks of tires and oil drums, and into the waiting area where a few customers sat flipping through magazines. The service advisor at the front desk glanced up, surprised by his sudden presence there. Before anyone could question him, Garrett turned toward the main shop floor and raised his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Everybody, stop what you're doing. The clatter of tools and hum of machinery slowed, then ceased altogether. Mechanics exchanged confused glances, wiping their hands on their overalls. Evans, standing near the lift with a wrench in hand, looked at him warily. Chris, still leaning against the office doorway, narrowed his eyes. Garrett reached up and pulled off the thick-rimmed glasses he had worn as part of his disguise. Then, with deliberate movements, he unzipped his grease-streaked overalls and shrugged them off, revealing the crisp button-down shirt he had worn underneath. A hush fell over the shop floor as recognition dawned. Chris stiffened. The service advisors at the counter went pale. Evan's eyebrows shot up. Garrett let the silence hang for a moment before speaking again. My name is Garrett Vaughn. I own this company. The air in the garage seemed to shift. Chris's face twitched, but he said nothing. The other employees looked between each other, unsure of how to react. Garrett turned his attention to the team. I built this business on honesty, on trust. I believed that when customers walked in here, we treated them fairly, gave them real solutions, and sent them home knowing they weren't being taken advantage of. But that's not what's been happening here, is it? Several mechanics shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. I came here undercover because I kept hearing complaints. Customers being charged for repairs they didn't need. Employees being pressured to upcharge or face consequences. A culture of fear, of dishonesty. I needed to see it for myself. Garrett turned his gaze to Chris, who had crossed his arms tightly over his chest, his jaw set. And now I have. Chris finally spoke, his voice clipped. Look, if you've got concerns, we can talk about them in private. No need to make a scene in front of the customers. Garrett shook his head. This isn't a private issue. This is a company-wide failure. One that's been happening under your leadership. Chris scoffed. Come on, Garrett. This is just how business works. You think the other shops in town aren't doing the same thing? You think dealerships are playing fair? We have quotas to meet, overhead to cover. You don't like the way I run things? Fine. But I've been making you money. Garrett took a step closer, his voice firm. You think I care about squeezing a little extra cash out of people at the expense of our reputation? At the expense of the trust we built? That's not making me money, that's killing this business from the inside out. Chris shrugged, his expression unreadable. It's just business. Garrett's eyes hardened. No. It's greed. And it stops today. He turned to the rest of the employees. Chris is no longer the manager of this shop. Effective immediately. A few gasps rippled through the room. Chris's face darkened, and for a moment Garrett thought he might argue. But then he let out a slow exhale, shaking his head. You're making a mistake, Chris muttered. Garrett didn't bother responding. He simply gestured toward the door. Chris hesitated, then grabbed his jacket from the office, brushing past the stunned employees as he strode outside. The door swung shut behind him. Garrett took a breath, then turned back to the team. I know some of you were just following orders. I know some of you didn't have a choice. But that ends now. This company is going back to what it was meant to be: honest, fair, and run with integrity. If you've been a part of the problem, this is your chance to come clean. If you've been trying to do the right thing but felt like you couldn't, that changes today. Evan, still standing near the lift, met Garrett's eyes. "You serious?" Garrett nodded. "Dead serious." Evan let out a slow breath and gave a small nod. "Then I'm in." A few others followed suit, murmuring their agreement. Some employees still looked uncertain, but Garrett could see the shift beginning. He wasn't just cleaning house, he was rebuilding the foundation. And this time, he would make sure no one tore it down again. The garage was still tense, the weight of what had just happened settling over the employees like a thick fog. Garrett scanned their faces, reading the uncertainty in their expressions. Some looked relieved, others wary. A few seemed outright skeptical. He didn't blame them. Trust wasn't going to be rebuilt with just a speech, it had to be proven. He turned to Evan, who was still standing near the lift, arms crossed. Garrett had seen his work firsthand. The guy was skilled, honest, and had the respect of his coworkers. That made him the obvious choice for what needed to happen next. Garrett pointed at him. "You're the most experienced mechanic here, right?" Evan hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "Yeah, I guess you could say that." "Good," Garrett replied. "Because I need someone who knows how this place actually runs, someone who cares about doing things the right way. I want you as interim shop lead while we get things back on track." Evan blinked, clearly caught off guard. A few of the other mechanics exchanged glances, murmuring under their breath. "You serious?" Evan asked. "Completely." Evan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I appreciate the offer, but I don't know if I'm the guy for that. I just do my job, keep my head down. I'm not exactly management material." Garrett shook his head. "That's exactly why you're the right guy for it. You care about the work. You care about the customers. That's what we need right now, someone who actually gives a damn." Evan glanced around as if gauging how the others felt about it. Some nodded subtly. A few of the younger mechanics looked hopeful. One of the senior techs, a man in his 50s with oil-streaked hands, finally spoke up. "If it means this place isn't going to be run like a scam anymore, I'm all for it." That seemed to settle it. Evan took a deep breath, then nodded. "All right, I'll do it. But only if I have the authority to actually change things." Garrett smiled. "That's the whole point." He turned back to the rest of the crew. "From now on, no more shady upselling. No more pressuring customers into unnecessary repairs. We do things right or we don't do them at all." A few nodded in agreement. Others still seemed cautious, waiting to see if this promise actually meant something. One of the younger mechanics, a guy barely out of trade school, hesitated before speaking up. "What about quotas? Are we still expected to hit certain sales numbers?" Garrett shook his head. "I'm not going to punish anyone for not squeezing extra money out of customers. Your job is to fix cars, not con people. We'll focus on doing good work. The money will follow." The tension in the room started to ease. Some of the mechanics, especially the younger ones, looked visibly relieved. Others still seemed unsure, but no one argued. Garrett knew this was just the first step. Garrett turned to the service advisors at the front desk. "I know Chris had you pushing unnecessary repairs. That stops now. If a customer doesn't need the work, we don't try to sell it to them. If they ask for an honest opinion, we give them one. No more games." One of the advisors, a woman in her 30s, nodded quickly. "I never liked doing it, but Chris made it clear we didn't have a choice." "You have a choice now," Garrett assured her. She nodded again, looking more relieved than anything. Garrett exhaled, then clapped his hands together. "All right, enough standing around. We've got cars to fix." Slowly, the team returned to their workstations. The energy in the shop had changed. It wasn't completely restored. Garrett knew that would take time, but the first step had been taken. Evan walked over as Garrett was about to head to the office. "You really think this is going to work?" Garrett met his gaze. "I do, but only if we make it work." Evan studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, let's do it." Garrett watched as Evan turned back to the shop floor, already stepping into his new role. The real work was just beginning. But for the first time in a long time, Garrett felt like his company was finally headed in the right direction again.